3 days after Mark left, Sarah sat in the office of Diane Reynolds, a divorce attorney known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach. The office was small but neat, with diplomas and certificates covering one wall and a large window overlooking the city on the other. "So, Mrs. Coleman," Diane said, flipping through the notes she'd taken, "you have evidence of your husband's infidelity, including credit card statements, hotel receipts, and," she raised an eyebrow, "a pair of another woman's underwear found in his drawer." Sarah nodded, pushing a folder across the desk. "Everything is in here. I also printed out text messages I found on our shared iPad. He forgot to log out of his accounts." Diane scanned the messages, her expression remaining professional despite the intimate details they contained. "These will be useful. Now, let's discuss what you want from this divorce." "I want what's fair," Sarah said firmly. "We bought the apartment together. I work from home, so I'd like to keep it. Beyond that, I just want this over with as cleanly as possible." Diane made some notes. "Has he contacted you since leaving?" 27 calls and 15 text messages, Sarah replied. "I haven't answered any of them." "Good. Keep it that way for now. All communication should go through me." Diane closed her notebook. "I'll file the papers today. Be prepared, though. Once he's served, he might get desperate." Sarah left the office feeling both lighter and heavier. The wheels were in motion now. There was no going back. When she arrived home, Sarah found a bouquet of roses on her doorstep with a card that simply said, "Please talk to me, Mark." She picked up the flowers and dropped them directly into the trash bin by the elevator. Inside her apartment, Sarah began a ritual she had started the day after Mark left. She went through each room, removing traces of him, a coffee mug he always used, books he'd left on the nightstand, his favorite throw pillow. Each item went into a box labeled Mark's Things. It was therapeutic in a strange way. As she cleaned out the bathroom cabinet, her phone rang. It was Kate. "How did it go with the lawyer?" her sister asked. "She's filing the papers today. Mark should be served by tomorrow. How are you holding up?" Sarah paused, considering the question. "I'm angry and hurt, but also relieved. Like I've been carrying this heavy doubt for months, and now at least I know the truth." "Have you told Mom and Dad yet?" Sarah sighed. "No, I'm having dinner with them this weekend. I'll tell them then." Her parents had loved Mark, had welcomed him into the family with open arms. This would break their hearts too. After hanging up, Sarah sat on the edge of the bathtub, suddenly overwhelmed. The bathroom still smelled faintly of Mark's cologne. She stood abruptly and grabbed a can of air freshener, spraying until the scent was masked by artificial lavender. The doorbell rang, startling her. Through the peephole, she saw Mark standing in the hallway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Sarah, please," he called through the door. "Just 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Sarah stood silently, her hand on the door. "I know you're in there," Mark continued. "Your car is in the parking lot. Please, Sarah, I made a terrible mistake. I want to make it right." Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door, but only as far as the security chain would allow. "There's nothing to discuss, Mark. My lawyer will contact yours." "I don't have a lawyer," Mark said, his eyes red-rimmed. "I don't want a divorce. I want to fix this." "You can't fix this," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You didn't make a mistake, Mark. You made a series of choices. Every time you texted her, called her, met her, those were all choices." "I love you," Mark whispered. Sarah looked at him, this man she had trusted, had built a life with. Once, those words would have melted her heart. Now, they just sounded hollow. "The divorce papers will be delivered tomorrow," she said quietly. "Please respect that this is what I want." She closed the door before he could respond, leaning against it as she heard his footsteps slowly retreat down the hallway. Tomorrow, she thought, would be another step forward in this new, unexpected journey. 2 weeks passed since Sarah filed for divorce. The apartment felt emptier, but somehow more peaceful without Mark's presence. She had repainted the living room a soft blue, replacing the beige that Mark had always insisted on. Small changes, but they helped her reclaim the space as her own. On Monday morning, Sarah's phone rang. It was Diane Reynolds. "Sarah, we have a court date," the lawyer said without preamble. Next Thursday at 9 a.m., Judge Harris will be presiding. Sarah's heart raced. So soon? I thought these things took months. Usually they do, but we got lucky with an opening in the court calendar. Plus, your case is fairly straightforward. Diane paused. There is something else. Mark has hired an attorney, Linda Pearson. She's requesting a meeting before the court date to discuss settlement terms. Sarah frowned. What kind of terms? He's contesting the division of assets. Claims he put more money into the apartment and wants compensation. That's not true, Sarah said, anger rising in her voice. We split everything equally. I have the bank statements to prove it. Bring those to my office tomorrow, Diane replied calmly. And Sarah? Start preparing yourself for court. It can be emotionally challenging. After hanging up, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the wall calendar. Thursday, just 9 days away. She picked up a red marker and circled the date, then wrote court in bold letters. Seeing it written down made it feel more real. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kate. Lunch today? Sarah typed back. Need to prepare for court. Thursday next week. Kate's response was immediate. I'm coming over. We'll bring food. An hour later, Kate arrived with takeout containers of pasta and a bottle of wine. As they ate at the small kitchen table, Sarah shared the latest development about Mark contesting the assets. He's just trying to make this difficult, Kate said, twirling pasta around her fork. Classic manipulation tactic. Sarah sighed. I just want this over with. I keep finding things that remind me of him. Yesterday, I found an old anniversary card in a book. It had all these promises about forever. Kate reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. This will end, and you'll be better for it. After lunch, Sarah pulled out a large plastic container from under her bed. Inside was the evidence she had been collecting. The red underwear in its plastic bag, credit card statements, hotel receipts, printed text messages, and a USB drive containing photos the private investigator had taken of Mark and Jessica entering a hotel together. Do you really need all of this? Kate asked, looking at the collection with wide eyes. Diane says it's better to have too much evidence than not enough, Sarah replied, especially the underwear. It's tangible proof. The judge needs to see it. Kate raised an eyebrow. You're actually bringing the underwear to court? Yes, Sarah said firmly. I need everyone to see. Mark, the judge, everyone, exactly what he did. How little respect he had for our marriage that he couldn't even hide another woman's underwear properly. That night, after Kate left, Sarah sat on her bed with a notepad, writing what she wanted to say in court. The words came easily, fueled by months of hurt and betrayal. When she finished writing, she read it aloud to the empty room, rehearsing her statement. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah met with Diane, organized her evidence, and even bought a new navy blue suit for court. Professional and serious, nothing flashy or attention-seeking. The night before the court date, Sarah couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, checking and rechecking her evidence box. The red underwear remained at the top, visible as soon as the lid was removed. It had become a symbol to her. Of betrayal, yes, but also of truth and the power of facing reality, no matter how painful. As dawn broke on Thursday morning, Sarah showered and dressed carefully. She applied minimal makeup and pulled her hair back into a neat bun. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized the determined woman staring back at her. This wasn't how she had imagined her life would turn out, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Time to finish this, she whispered to her reflection as she picked up the evidence box and headed for the door. The courthouse was busier than Sarah had expected. People rushed through the marble hallways, their footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. Sarah clutched her evidence box tightly as she followed Diane toward courtroom C. Remember, let me do most of the talking, Diane advised as they walked. Only speak when the judge addresses you directly or when I indicate you should. Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry for words. As they approached the courtroom doors, she saw Mark standing with a tall woman in a gray suit, his lawyer, Linda Pearson. Mark looked thinner, with dark circles under his eyes. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he started to move toward her. Sarah, can we? No communication with my client, Diane interrupted firmly, stepping between them. They entered the courtroom and took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Sarah placed her evidence box on the floor beside her chair. Across the aisle, Mark and his lawyer settled at the defendant's table. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Harris," called the court officer. Everyone stood as a stern-looking man in black robes entered and took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," Judge Harris said, opening a folder before him. "We're here for case number 47,382, Coleman versus Coleman. Petition for divorce on grounds of adultery." He looked up at both parties. "Counselors, your opening statements, please." Diane rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client, Sarah Coleman, seeks dissolution of her 7-year marriage to Mark Coleman on grounds of proven infidelity. We have substantial evidence to present, including financial records, photographic evidence, and physical proof of Mr. Coleman's relationship with another woman." When Linda Pearson stood for Mark's side, her approach was different. "Your Honor, my client does not contest that there was infidelity in the marriage. Mr. Coleman deeply regrets his actions and has taken full responsibility. Our concern today is only with the fair division of assets." The judge nodded and made some notes. "Mrs. Coleman's counsel may present evidence." Diane methodically presented the financial records and photographs. Sarah watched Mark's face as images of him and Jessica entering the hotel appeared on the courtroom monitor. He stared at the floor, his face flushed with shame. "And finally, Your Honor," Diane said, "we have physical evidence discovered by Mrs. Coleman in the marital home." She turned to Sarah and nodded. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached into the box and removed the plastic bag containing the red underwear. She handed it to Diane, who presented it to the judge. "Mrs. Coleman found this item belonging to another woman hidden in Mr. Coleman's personal dresser drawer," Diane explained. The judge examined the evidence with a neutral expression. As he handed it back to Diane, a commotion from the back of the courtroom caught everyone's attention. A young woman with blonde hair stood up from the spectator seats. "That's not mine," she called out. The judge banged his gavel. Silence in the court. "Who are you, ma'am?" The woman walked forward. "I'm Jessica Barnes. I was involved with Mark Coleman." She glanced at Mark, who looked stunned to see her. "But those aren't mine. I never owned underwear like that." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt as if the floor was tilting beneath her. If the underwear didn't belong to Jessica, then whose was it? "Your Honor," Diane said, recovering quickly, "regardless of who this item belongs to, the other evidence clearly establishes Mr. Coleman's infidelity." "Agreed," the judge said, "but this raises an interesting question." He looked directly at Mark. "Mr. Coleman, would you care to explain?" Mark stood slowly, looking first at Jessica, then at Sarah, and finally at the red underwear still held by Diane. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible, "there's something I need to explain that I haven't told anyone. Not my lawyer, not Jessica, and certainly not Sarah." The courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone leaned forward slightly, waiting for what Mark would say next. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, a strange feeling of dread washing over her. "The truth is," Mark continued, "there wasn't just one affair. There were others." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This was worse than she had imagined. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harris banged his gavel 3 times, restoring order. "Mr. Coleman, are you stating under oath that you had multiple affairs during your marriage?" the judge asked, his expression severe. Mark nodded, then seemed to remember himself. "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah felt as if she'd been struck. One affair had been devastating enough. The idea that there were others made her stomach turn. She stared at the man she had once loved, now a stranger before her. "How many others?" Judge Harris asked. Mark swallowed visibly. 2 others besides Jessica. Jessica Barnes, still standing in the aisle, looked as shocked as Sarah. "You told me I was the only one," she said, her voice breaking. The judge banged his gavel again. "Miss Barnes, please take a seat or leave the courtroom." Jessica returned to her seat, wiping tears from her eyes. Sarah felt a strange connection with her in that moment, both of them betrayed by the same man. "Your Honor," Linda Pearson said, "this is the first I'm hearing of this." May I request a brief recess to confer with my client? Denied, said the judge firmly. Mr. Coleman, continue your explanation about the evidence presented. Mark loosened his tie slightly. The red underwear? It could belong to Vanessa or Rachel. I don't remember which one left it. The cold, clinical way he named the women sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Who was this man she had married? Suddenly, a woman with dark hair stood up from the back of the courtroom. I'm Rachel Wilson, she announced. And those aren't mine either. The judge sighed heavily and banged his gavel again. This is not a television drama, people. Sit down, Ms. Wilson. Before Rachel could sit, another woman stood up near the door, tall with auburn hair. I'm Vanessa Taylor. Mark and I were together for about 3 months last year, but I never left any underwear at his place. Sarah looked around in disbelief. Had all 3 women Mark cheated with somehow known about the court date? She glanced at Diane, who looked equally confused. Your Honor, Diane began, this is highly irregular. I'm aware, Counselor, the judge interrupted. He turned to Mark. Mr. Coleman, if the item doesn't belong to any of these women, how do you explain its presence in your drawer? Mark's face had turned an alarming shade of white. He looked desperately at his lawyer, who seemed at a loss for words. The bailiff approached the bench and whispered something to Judge Harris. The judge's eyebrows shot up and he nodded. This court will take a 15-minute recess, he announced, standing abruptly. Mr. Coleman, you'll remain in the courtroom with your counsel. As the judge left, the courtroom burst into conversation. Sarah turned to Diane. What's happening? I'm not sure, Diane admitted, but I think the bailiff had some information for the judge. During the recess, Sarah noticed a court clerk talking to Mark and his lawyer. Mark's face grew even paler, and he put his head in his hands. When Judge Harris returned, the room fell silent immediately. Before we continue, the judge said, I need to address a matter brought to my attention by court staff. He looked directly at Mark. Mr. Coleman, the bailiff has informed me that a member of courthouse security recognized you from your frequent visits to this building over the past year, visits that coincide with the schedule of Judge Melissa Williams in courtroom E. Sarah frowned, not understanding the implication. Would you care to explain these visits, Mr. Coleman? Judge Harris continued. Mark stood shakily. I was representing clients in Judge Williams' courtroom. According to court records, you had no cases before Judge Williams, the judge countered. Security footage shows you waiting in the hallway outside her chambers on multiple occasions. A collective gasp went through the courtroom as understanding dawned. Sarah felt dizzy as the pieces fell into place. Mr. Coleman, Judge Harris said, his voice stern, are you claiming that you were also involved in a relationship with Judge Williams? Mark didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. This case will be transferred to another jurisdiction immediately, Judge Harris announced. The allegations of improper conduct involving a member of the judiciary must be investigated separately. Sarah sat frozen in her seat. The red underwear that had seemed so important now felt insignificant compared to this new revelation. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her with multiple women, he had potentially compromised the legal system itself. As security officers approached Mark, Sarah finally understood that the truth was far more shocking than she could have ever imagined. The following 2 weeks were a blur for Sarah. After the bombshell revelation in court, the case had been transferred to a neighboring county, and Mark was under investigation by the Judicial Ethics Committee. The scandal had made the local newspaper, though thankfully they had not printed Sarah's name. Today, she sat in a new courtroom, this one smaller and less intimidating than the last. Judge Eleanor Martinez presided, a woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Mrs. Coleman, Judge Martinez addressed Sarah directly. I've reviewed the evidence and the transcript from the previous hearing. I want to assure you that this court takes your petition very seriously. Sarah nodded gratefully. Diane sat beside her, a steadying presence. Before we proceed, the judge continued, I understand there is still the matter of the unidentified evidence. She was referring to the red underwear, which remained in its plastic bag on the evidence table. Yes, Your Honor, Diane replied. We still don't know who it belongs to, but given Mr. Coleman's admitted multiple affairs, we believe its ownership is secondary to the established pattern of infidelity. Judge Martinez nodded, then turned to Mark and his new attorney, a somber man named Richard Grant. Mark's previous lawyer had withdrawn from the case after the revelation about Judge Williams. "Mr. Coleman, do you wish to make any statement regarding this item of evidence?" the judge asked. Mark whispered something to his lawyer, who frowned and shook his head. This exchange happened twice more before Mark finally stood up. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "I'd like to tell the truth, the complete truth." The room fell silent. Sarah braced herself for yet another revelation of betrayal. "The underwear." Mark paused, taking a deep breath. "It's mine." Sarah blinked rapidly, certain she had misheard. "What?" The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Coleman, please clarify." Mark's shoulders slumped as if a great weight had been lifted from them. "The red underwear belongs to me. I bought it online 6 months ago. I sometimes wear women's underwear. It's something I've kept hidden from everyone, including my wife." Sarah stared at her husband, unable to process this information. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, this had never crossed her mind. "I never cheated with Judge Williams," Mark continued. "I was seeing her professionally, in a therapist-patient relationship. She maintains a private practice as a licensed psychologist when she's not on the bench. I was too embarrassed to admit I was seeing a therapist, especially for this issue, so I never told anyone." Judge Martinez made some notes. "This can be verified, I assume?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mark's lawyer replied, passing a document to the court clerk. "We have a signed release from Judge Williams confirming their professional relationship, with my client's permission to disclose this information for the record." Sarah felt as if the room was spinning. Mark had been hiding something, yes, but it wasn't what she had thought. The affairs with Jessica, Rachel, and Vanessa were real. He had admitted to those. But the underwear that had started this whole process belonged to them. "Mrs. Coleman," Judge Martinez said gently, "I understand this information may be surprising to you. Would you like a brief recess?" Sarah shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I'd like to continue." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. The judge nodded and returned to the legal matters at hand. "Given Mr. Coleman's admissions of multiple extramarital affairs, this court finds sufficient grounds for divorce on the basis of adultery. We will now proceed to the division of assets." As the lawyers discussed property and finances, Sarah found herself looking at Mark, really looking at him, perhaps for the first time. Behind the betrayal and lies was a person she had never fully known, someone who had been hiding his true self not just from her but from the world. She didn't feel anger in that moment, or even hurt. Instead, she felt a profound sadness for the years they had spent together, each hiding parts of themselves, he more than her, certainly, but neither of them completely honest. When the court adjourned for lunch, Sarah found herself standing face to face with Mark in the hallway. The first words that came to her weren't accusations or expressions of anger. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked simply. Mark looked at her with tears in his eyes. "I was afraid." And then one secret led to another, and another. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. Not just for the affairs, but for never being brave enough to be honest with you." 1 year had passed since the divorce was finalized. Autumn leaves crunched under Sarah's boots as she walked through the park, a takeaway coffee warming her hands. The bench where she sat every Sunday morning came into view, and today, like most weeks, someone was already waiting for her. "You're late," Kate said, scooting over to make room. "I was about to call you." "Sorry," Sarah replied with a small smile. "I was finishing a design for a new client. Lost track of time." After the divorce, Sarah had transformed her virtual assistant job into a successful graphic design business. The apartment was now officially hers, redecorated completely, with a spare bedroom converted into a home office. "So, did you hear the news?" Kate asked, pulling out her phone. "Mark is getting married again." Sarah raised her eyebrows. "Already? To who?" Kate showed her a social media post. Mark standing beside a tall man with a short beard, both of them smiling widely. A simple gold band was visible on Mark's left hand. "His name is Daniel. He's a therapist, apparently," Kate explained. "They met in a support group for divorced men. Mark came out publicly about 6 months ago." Sarah studied the photo. Mark looked happier than she had seen him in years, perhaps ever. There was an openness to his face that had never been there during their marriage. Good for him, Sarah said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. After the court case concluded, Sarah had gone through a period of intense anger and confusion. How could she have been married to someone for 7 years and never truly known him? The affairs had been painful enough, but the realization that Mark had hidden his sexuality and identity from her had been another kind of betrayal. Therapy had helped. So had the support group Kate had convinced her to join, women who had discovered their husbands were gay or bisexual during their marriages. Through their stories, Sarah came to understand that Mark's deception hadn't been personal. His affairs and lies had been desperate attempts to avoid facing his truth, harmful to them both. "Are you okay seeing this?" Kate asked cautiously, putting her phone away. "I am," Sarah said. "Actually, I ran into Mark last month at the grocery store. We talked for a few minutes." Kate's eyes widened. "You never told me. How was it?" "Surprisingly normal." He apologized again. Said he'd been in therapy steadily since the divorce. He asked about my business. Sarah paused, remembering. He seemed authentic, like he finally knew who he was. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a group of children play with a dog nearby. "Oh, I almost forgot," Kate said suddenly. "Mom wanted me to remind you about Thanksgiving. She's insisting you bring someone this year." Sarah laughed. Is she still trying to set me up with her dentist's son? And her hairdresser's nephew and Dad's golf buddy's grandson, Kate added with an eye roll. "Well, she'll be disappointed," Sarah replied. "But I am bringing someone. Sort of." Kate turned to her sister with curious eyes. "What? Who? You haven't mentioned anyone." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Kate a photo of a small brown puppy with floppy ears. "I'm picking her up from the shelter next week. Her name is Luna." "A dog?" Kate squealed. "Mom's going to be so mad that this is your someone." "She'll get over it," Sarah said, smiling down at the photo. "I'm not ready for a relationship yet, but I'm ready for this." As they walked out of the park later, Sarah reflected on the strange journey of the past year. The red underwear that she had brought to court, intending it to be proof of Mark's betrayal, had instead become the first step toward truth for both of them. Mark was finally living honestly, and she was rebuilding her life on her own terms. That night, Sarah stood on her apartment balcony, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the plastic box she had packed away in storage, the one that contained the court documents and the infamous red underwear that the judge had returned to her, no longer needed as evidence. She had kept it, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a symbol of how the truth, however painful, could ultimately set people free. Tomorrow, she decided, she would finally throw it away. She didn't need physical reminders anymore. The past was finished. Her future, with its new business, new puppy, and endless possibilities, was just beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, Sarah Coleman was exactly where she wanted to be.